Okay, how's everybody doing today? Good, lots of thumbs up. Good, okay. So today we're getting into our second book here, Merceau Investigation, and we're the first two chapters, right? So let me just, oops, where did I put it? So I put up our reading question for the book on our Google Classroom. So that is going to be due next Monday, okay? So that will be, some of you already answered, which is great, but it's up on the Google Classroom. This will be due next Monday. If for some reason you are having a hard time accessing Google Classroom and can't get to it or just don't have access to it, just send me your responses via email. That's the easiest way if you can't get access to Google Classroom for some reason, okay? So that'll be due for next Monday, that reading that question, or answering the question. We're gonna be reading the next two chapters for next Monday as well. So it's about 25 pages. It's about the same amount as today. But we'll get through this book pretty quickly. This book is not even, it's 140 pages. So it's a pretty quick read. Like I said, our last class, should take about 2 weeks. Very slow tempo, 2 weeks of reading. Not gonna be reading big chunks of it. I think that's best for everybody right now. But before we get into it, before we sort of talk about these two chapters, I'm sort of curious what you all thought about it. What did you think about these first two chapters, especially in relation to reading The Stranger a couple weeks ago? So what do you think so far? Or what do you think so far? You can just start talking whenever you feel like.
I found it like more interesting and engaging than The Stranger, just because it's like it's almost like watching a court case, like someone defending, you know.
Okay, so yeah, I can see I can see that. I was like a court case, somebody defending somebody else, giving the other side of the story. Georgia, yes.
I feel like it was easier to follow than the beginning of The Stranger. Because like this whole thing was, hi, I'm here and I'm feeling all these emotions and I'm going to clearly lay it out for you. Whereas The Stranger was just like, hi, my mom died today, and you know?
Yeah, I can see. Okay, so the fact that our narrator here, whose name, anybody remember what his name is? Yeah, Georgia. Yeah, Huran. It's on page 7. It's really briefly mentioned. He only mentions his name once, and that's on page 7. But so that means that's Aaron. That means Aaron if you're going to translate it from Arabic. Yeah. So that would be Aaron in Arabic. I'm not totally butchering that. I believe that's the case. But that's his name. And I remember what the brother's name. I mean, we should remember what the brother's name is.
Musa.
Musa, right? M-U-S-A. This is also translated. I think this might be important. Anybody remember what his name, or anybody know what his name translates to in English? Anybody look this up?
Moses.
Yeah, Summer is right. It means Moses, which makes sense for how our narrator is depicting him, in the way that our narrator is talking about his brother. It makes sense that he's called Moses. In many ways, that he's viewed in some ways as very godlike at times. Other impressions about these first two chapters reads like, as Zoe says, like sort of reads like a court case, getting another side of the picture. And as Georgia, I think, really suggests too, there's a lot more emotions attached to this story as opposed to The Stranger, which feels very, very cold and very sort of like distant. This one is like, we are all in emotions in this book. But any other impressions, just like reading a novel that is kind of combative against another novel? Any other impressions about that?
I thought it was really interesting, especially because before I like started reading it, I didn't really like know it was about like his brother. So I don't know, and I think I just kind of like connect to like on a different level because he's also like Arab and Muslim like me. So
Mhm.
then it just kind of makes me like feel like I guess it just kind of makes me like feel for him just like a lot more on like a personal level than like I thought I would have.
Okay,
Yeah.
that's interesting. So do you have like a I don't want to say deeper connection, but you have like a more of I'll say a connection
Yeah.
with the
'Cause,
character because.
mm-hmm. Like him like when he like would describe like his neighborhood and stuff, it just kind of like I can like relate to it in like a sort of way, like me growing up like around like my neighborhood, like a lot of people that like were just like me, I guess.
Cool. I think it's really, no, I think it's a really important aspect of this novel too,
Yeah.
right? Is that our author here, and this is the book here, he's trying to give a voice to characters in this novel that's celebrated, right? Give a voice for people who were just sort of ignored and silenced. You're called in The Stranger just the Arab. But in this novel, we have names. And for our narrator, that's important. Our narrator is like, names matter here to a certain extent. Our narrator also has some issues with them that I think we can have to think about too. But in many ways, this novel is trying to give Musa, right, the murdered man and the stranger, trying to give him at least a voice or a presence, a body, a history. Um, and so I always like, find it really cool when stories, like I said, sort of write back against other stories or revise earlier stories. What do you think about that? The idea that this story, this novel is revising an earlier, an earlier novel. Like, do you resist that they're like trying to rewrite a story, or do you go along with it and like this is, I don't know, interesting, but it's doing something different. So I saw Mick's hand, then Grace. I'll say your hand.
I mean, I personally don't really think it's like trying to rewrite the story. It's kind of like, okay, so this was his view, but here's mine. Like, this is how it impacted me and my
Mhm.
family and like all this stuff. Like, there's always two sides to a story.
Right.
And so he's trying to be like, he's trying to communicate how, like, like his side of the story and how like you shouldn't be so like single-minded and stuff.
Okay. Okay. So I just to push back against that a little bit. What do you think of like the idea of having two sides of the story, right? But what do you think about being a different author writing it for you, Mick? Like a different author is writing this story. If it were like the same, Camus writing the same, like both sides of the story, was a different author. What do you think about that?
I mean, I think it definitely gives you like a whole different perspective that you probably wouldn't even think about
Okay.
because like they're both in different settings. They're both like experiencing such different things. Like he was like I remember when he talked about like learning French to try and like
Hmm.
communicate his story to others. Like I just think like if you take such drastic measures, like you want your side of the story to be heard, and I don't know. I
Okay.
thought that was really interesting.
Okay. So Grace, what were you to say?
I was just basically gonna say what Mick said, but I don't really think he's trying to rewrite the story. I think it's more he's trying to give like his brother an identity and like show that he's like a human being because we were just told by more so that like he
Mhm.
referred to him as the Arab man and that was it. And like
Mhm.
nothing more was ever like said about him. So I
Right.
think he was trying to give his brother an identity and like kind of just like Mick said, show his side.
Right. I think that's a good idea. I think that's both those ideas are really great. Like the idea of making the Arab and the stranger a human, right? Not just this sort of big term, the Arab, right? It's very, it has something attached to it, but it's very vague. But with our book here, we're trying to make them human. We're trying to give these characters sort of a human identity. Um, so there's a lot to that. And I think this is really great. This novel does a lot of good stuff in that it is trying to add a different side or more sides to a story that is celebrated. And our narrator here, you're on your sort of note saying like everybody knows this book. Everybody's read this book before, The Stranger. And it sounds very mathematical and it sounds very cold. But and this is on page 2. He says he's talking about Camus, but also talking about Rousseau, who's writing the book. who's like narrating the book. It says here on page 2, he writes so well that his words are like precious stones, jewels cut with utmost precision. A man very strict about shades of meaning your hero was. They practically required them to be mathematical, endless calculations based on gems and minerals. Have you seen the way he writes? He was writing about a gunshot and he makes it sound like poetry. His world is clean, clear, exact, honed by morning sunlight, which is what we talked about. The thing that we talked about the murder, when we talked about in The Stranger, the environment and how the sun is like playing this major role in Merceau's actions. That's what this novel sort of like, that's ridiculous. He murdered a man. Don't try to make it poetic. Don't try to make it into this bigger thing that it's not. So we have the novel directly responding to an earlier one, the story that's 50 years old, 60 years old, responding 60 years later, right? Well, okay, so we have our narrator here. Who is he talking to? Because he's talking to someone. Keep on reading it. There you go. So who's he talking to? Who's our narrator speaking to? Because he's talking to someone. Yeah, Georgia.
Isn't he talking to someone like in a bar or like a restaurant? Because he mentions like, I always pick up the tab the first times.
Right. They're at a bar. They're in a bar and he's talking to someone. So they're in a bar, but who do we think he's talking to?
Can I say something?
Yeah.
I think in a way he's talking to us. He's talking to anybody that's going to listen to him.
Okay, so he's talking to us like anybody who's going to, okay, I can see that. I think there's a lot to that, that we are the readers of. Like he's the one he's talking to, right?
Yeah, it seems like he doesn't really have like much left to give to the world, and I feel like he's just trying to give his brother something that he'll never have.
Mm-hmm.
And it's kind of like a hopeless journey.
You feel it's kind of hopeless, like this is all, I'm an old man now and this is all I have left, and now it's...
I feel like a lot of his book is just rage about the success of the fact that this guy was a murderer.
Okay, I think, yeah, he does feel very angry. I think the idea of rage is pretty appropriate. He does feel angry.
I mean, his like the way he writes sounds like he's raging a little bit.
Mm-hmm. I mean, it makes sense that he'd feel angry because he's like, nobody knows what happened to Musa's body. His body seemingly disappeared.
Yeah.
We've got to figure out, or give us any sort of reconciliation. And the murderer has been viewed as this larger than life, not hero, but figure that we read and continue to read their story and don't think about the murdered person. So our narrator, Aaron, is like, let's not celebrate this man anymore, right? So we have him. I think Lily's right in respect that the person he's talking to is many ways us, right? Us as readers, that we have read The Stranger, and we know what they're talking about, because he says again on page 2, I'm sure that you're like everyone else. You've read the tale as told by the man who wrote it. But we also do have a person, right? Our narrator is speaking to someone. And he sort of mocks him a little bit too. He mocks him a little bit. He calls him like the student detective at some point. He also says, you probably got the book in your backpack, so go and read it. At one point, Huron is saying on page 4, do you happen to have the book in your school bag there? He calls him a young friend. Good, play the disciple and read me the first page or two. So the book is like actively telling you, go get The Stranger, go read that first page, come back to this book. So the person he's talking to it seems to be a very young person, perhaps a student in college maybe, that can go into a bar, is reading the book. Somehow they got into this conversation. But our narrator is also relating the story to this person, this nameless person who is listening and hoping that they write it all down. Because at some point they say, write it all down, make sure you got it all. He says this on 14. I want you to write it in big letters. Half a century after his birth and death, the man has just been given a name, I insist. And then as Georgia pointed out on page 14, no, the first day I always pick up the tab. By the way, what's your name? Right? Okay. So this novel is also, I think is really important for us to think about. It's very subtle in that it has to, and this goes back to the Google question I've sort of posit to all of you, whether or not we should trust this narrator, whether or not he is someone that we can be like, I completely put my trust in you and everything you say, everything you tell me is true. Because there are some things that the narrator says are like, wait a second, how do you know these things? Are you admitting that you don't know these things? And if you admit you don't know these things, then why are you still telling me this stuff happens anyway? So a lot of the time, we get to question our narrator and what they know. Because anybody remember how old he was when Musa died or was killed? Because he gives us his age at one point. I forget what page it's on exactly, but he says on page 22, on the last day of his life, I was 7 years old. And so I don't know any more about him than what I've told you. And this is on page 22. He's like, I don't know any more about my brother than what I just told you in the first 22 pages. We have another 100 pages to go. So he's only 7 years old when his brother died. He also says at one point, I don't know what happened between 6 a.m. and 2 p.m. that day my brother died. I don't know what happened. And this is on page 18. No, not on page 18. Where did it say? On page 17. What can I tell you, Mr. Investigator, about a crime committed in a book? I don't know what happened on that particular day. I don't know what happened on the day my brother was murdered, basically, in that gruesome summer between 6 o'clock in the morning and 2 in the afternoon, the hour of Musa's death. But then he says on the next page, so on that particular day, nothing unusual happened. But he's like, I don't know what happened that day, but afterwards I do. But he says, later, of course, is at page 18 as well, and that's a big paragraph. Later, of course, I thought about it, and little by little I concluded that there must be, among the 1,000 versions Mama offered, among her memory fragments and her still vivid intuitions, there must be one version truer than the others, one version of Musa's death that's truer than all the others, right? So we have this moment, or all these moments, where we should be like, wait, how much do you know? How much are you making up? How much are you piecing together? How much do you remember? How much are you fabricating? This is a novel that is really, really questioning what memory can do. And if you're in autobio, this is like everything about memory that we talked about in that class. This is coming up in this book. What can you remember? What can be truthful in terms of your memory? But we're simultaneously having characters given names, like we're giving a name to a character. We should be celebrating that. But can we trust everything our narrator is telling us about what's going on, right? So there are a lot of instances whenever our narrator says, I don't remember exactly, that should like click off something on our head, like, okay, what are you going to say? Are you making this up? Are you fabricating it? Or is it the truth? Who gets to decide what the truth is here, right? Who gets to decide what we should believe? Because our narrator is like into this. This is his story. So we can't say your story is wrong, or not truthful, but is it factual? So there's like a sort of like a split there between the two. And we also have with the novel opening up with the line, Mama's still alive today, as opposed to in The Stranger, was like mama died today, right? So it's like automatically the novel is telling us it's going to be responding in many different ways to the earlier novel. But then our narrator says, unlike me, in terms of his mama, I've rehashed this story in my head so often, I almost can't remember it anymore. That should be the first line that we like, okay, we have to really think about what's going on in this novel. So we have a lot of things happening. We have our narrator, who is much older, as he says, constantly rehashing the story that he almost can't remember it anymore. Also in a bar a lot, seems to be very, very into drinking. As it says sort of in the end of chapter 2, where he starts talking with all the people he sees in the bar. He's a regular at this bar that they're at. And he says in this last paragraph of the chapter 2, there he is again. No, don't turn around. I call him the bottle ghost. He comes here almost every day, as often as I do. We acknowledge each other without ever saying a word. I'll tell you more about him later. And he starts talking about drinking. He says, I started drinking a little early, but I've got a good excuse, my acid reflux attacks, which tend to come at night. So he's sort of delving into alcoholism, if not really deep into alcoholism, our narrator. And he talks about the bars and talks about who goes to bars. And remember, we meet our narrator in the bar. The bar is still open in this country. So Algeria, our aquariums are containing, and this is on page 25, containing mostly bottom feeders, weighed down and scraping along. You come here when you want to escape your age, your God, or your wife, I believe, but in any case, haphazardly. And he calls them all like trapped rats. He's not separate from all that, right? He's part of that. So our narrator is really complex, has this really traumatic past that he can't get over, is trying to piece this narrative together, but when it happened, he was only 7 years old. Even though it was a really extremely traumatic experience, he still's like, I don't remember most of the stuff. My mom was making all these legends up about my brother. I barely know him or knew him. But I'm going to tell you about him anyway. So we're all constantly sort of fluctuating. How should we understand this character? How should we believe anything our narrator says? Is this a truthful story about a man who's suffering? Or is this like a story of a drunkard just like wanting to talk to somebody? It could be both, right? It could be both. But both sides sort of come out simultaneously at the same time, which makes this a really complex novel, even though it reads pretty simply. It reads pretty simply, but there's all these little pieces that pop in that makes us question what our narrator is saying. And I think that we have to remember that too as we read, that to constantly question what the narrator is saying. All right. But as I mentioned, like a couple classes prior, or last class, this novel is participating in a history of rewriting older stories and giving characters names that were not given names. This is usually like people of color who were denied names. And now we have a name for a character who was denied a name in the original. If anybody's read Jane Eyre, has anybody read Jane Eyre before? Well, okay. There's a character in Jane Eyre who's the mad woman in the attic. She's from the Caribbean. There's a novel called Wide Sargasso Sea, which gives her a whole life before Jane Eyre, like rewriting that story. So this is a really common way that a lot of contemporary literature tries to give different characters new life, and by giving them a name. So this book is participating in that history. It's nothing new, but it's doing something that a lot of authors around the globe that aren't, British or American, from Africa, from the continent, from all around the world, think it's necessary to do. Let's give these characters names. Let's give them lives. Let's make them human, right? And by making them human too, they also have to have faults. They can't just be perfect. They have to be human. And I think it's important too. So the fact that our narrator is unreliable makes him human. Any final thoughts on these first two chapters? Because I could keep going with this, but I know it's exhausting to look at a computer screen all day long. So Any final thoughts on just these first 2 chapters? Okay, so what we're gonna do next, like I said at the beginning of class, next Monday, we're gonna read chapters 3 and 4. I'm gonna scan those later today and put them up in the Google Classroom. I also put them up in the portal. And also remember to respond to the question for Monday. Okay, respond to the question and then respond to someone else's response. So that will be due Monday. All right. I think I did the. Make sure you respond to somebody else's response by Tuesday. So you have time to look through and see which one you'd like to respond to as well. So respond to the question on Google Classroom by Monday. Respond to somebody else's response by Tuesday. Okay? And I'll put the next two chapters up for Monday's class. All right? Okay. Hope you all have a great weekend. Okay? And I'll see you all on Monday. All right, everybody.